there is a radio transmission. It was recorded on July 29th, 1953, at exactly 6:22 in the morning, local time, somewhere over the Sea of Japan. A voice, an American voice, calm at first, then cracking with static, and something worse than static. Fear. The voice belongs to a captain in the United States Air Force. His aircraft, a modified B-50 Super Fortress, redesignated RB-50G, tail number 47-145, had been flying a signals intelligence mission along the Soviet coastline, eavesdropping, listening, harvesting frequencies. And then, 2 Soviet MiG-17 interceptors appeared on his wing. What happened next took less than 90 seconds. Cannon fire ripped through the fuselage. The number 3 engine exploded. The aircraft began to spiral. The captain's last confirmed transmission, picked up by a Navy listening post in northern Japan, was 6 words. 6 words that the United States government would spend the next 40 years pretending were never spoken. He said, "We are going down, all surviving." And then silence. Not the silence of a crash, not the silence of an explosion, the silence of erasure. Because within 72 hours of that transmission, the United States Air Force informed the families of the 17 crew members aboard that aircraft that their sons, their husbands, their fathers had been killed instantly in a mid-air accident during a routine training flight over international waters. No hostile action, no Soviet involvement, no survivors. That was the official story. That was the story printed in the hometown newspapers. That was the story read by a mother in Dayton, Ohio, who folded an American flag and placed it in a glass case on her mantle and never opened it again. That flag is where our story begins, but it is not where it ends, because that captain, the one who said all surviving, he did not die over the Sea of Japan. And what I am about to show you is the evidence exposed across 5 decades of lies, cover-ups, and one impossible confession from a Russian president that he and at least 3 of his crew members landed alive on Soviet soil, were taken to a military processing facility, were photographed, were interrogated, and were never, ever returned. Before we go any further, I need you to understand something about the world in 1953. The Korean War was grinding into its final months. The armistice would be signed 4 days after this shootdown. 4 days. But behind the war, everyone could see was another war. A shadow war fought in the thin, frozen air above the Arctic Circle, above the Sea of Japan, above the Baltic, above every contested border where American aircraft pushed closer and closer to Soviet airspace. Not to bomb, not to fight, to listen. The United States had built an entire fleet of modified bombers, stripped of their offensive weapons and packed with electronic surveillance equipment. RB-29s, RB-50s, RB-47s. These aircraft flew along the edges of the Soviet Union, sucking up radar emissions, recording military radio traffic, mapping air defense networks. Officially, these missions did not exist. The crews who flew them were told that if they were captured, the United States would deny knowledge of their mission. That was not a warning. That was a promise. And the men who climbed into those aircraft understood exactly what it meant. If something went wrong up there, in the frozen gray nothing between Alaska and Siberia, between Japan and Vladivostok, they were on their own. Their government would not come for them. Their government would not even admit they were there. Now here is the question that is going to pull you through the next hour. How many of those men, the ones who were shot down, the ones who survived, the ones who transmitted all surviving into radios that someone was listening to, how many of them actually died? And how many of them simply disappeared into a system so vast and so secret that even their own country chose to forget they existed? The official number, the one the Pentagon has maintained for 70 years, is 0. 0 American airmen survived shoot-downs over Soviet territory. 0 were held as prisoners. 0 were interrogated, imprisoned, or transferred to labor camps. 0. That is the number. That is the wall. And what I found behind that wall is something I was not prepared for. I do not think you will be either. So stay with me, because every piece of evidence from this point forward has been either classified, denied, or buried, and we are going to dig it all up. Think about that for a moment. Really sit with it. You are a 22-year-old radio operator from Ohio. You have a mother who writes you letters every week. You have a girl back home who said she would wait for you. You climb into a modified bomber at 3 in the morning on a Japanese runway, knowing that if something goes wrong in the next 8 hours, your country will pretend you were never there, that your mission never happened, that you never existed, and you do it anyway. Because someone told you it mattered. Someone told you the intelligence you gathered up there, the radar signals and the radio frequencies and the scraps of encrypted Soviet chatter was keeping your country safe. And maybe it was. But the men who told you that, the generals and the intelligence directors and the policy makers in Washington, had already made a separate calculation, one they never shared with you. They had already decided that if the worst happened, if the MiGs found you and the cannons tore through your fuselage and you somehow survived the fall, they would not come for you. They would write your name on a form, they would fold a flag, and they would move on to the next mission. You were a line item in a classified budget, and line items do not get rescued. They get written off. The RB-50G that went down on July 29, 1953, was not the first American reconnaissance aircraft shot down by the Soviet Union. It was not even the 10th. By the time that crew climbed into their aircraft at Yokota Air Base in Japan for what would be their final mission, at least 16 American aircraft had already been attacked or destroyed by Soviet fighters along the periphery of the Iron Curtain. 16. And here is the detail that should disturb you. The American public knew about almost none of them. A Navy PB-4Y2 privateer shot down over the Baltic Sea in April 1950 with 10 crew members aboard. Gone. A Navy P-2V Neptune attacked over the Sea of Japan in November 1951. Damaged, but made it back. An Air Force RB-29 shot down near Hokkaido in June 1952. 13 crew. The wreckage was never recovered. The families of those earlier crews received the same treatment, the same condolence letters, the same fabricated cover stories, the same sealed caskets shipped home with military honors, buried with full ceremony, wept over by mothers and wives and children who had no idea that the box they were lowering into the ground might be empty. Because in several documented cases, the caskets were empty. There was nothing to bury. The crews had not crashed into the ocean. They had not burned in a wreckage field. They had walked away from their aircraft and into Soviet custody. But the caskets were sent anyway, weighted with sandbags to feel right when the pallbearers carried them. Sealed shut with orders that they were never to be opened for identification, sealed, because there was nothing inside to identify. The pattern was already carved deep by the time our RB-50G took off that morning. American planes went up, Soviet fighters came, and the men inside either made it home or they vanished into a silence so complete that their own families were given fabricated stories about mechanical failures and training accidents. But the RB-50G mission on July 29, 1953, was different. It was different because of what happened after. I want to stop here and tell you something about one of those earlier incidents, because it matters, because it establishes a pattern, and because the name that keeps appearing in the documents, Khabarovsk, shows up here first. On November 6, 1951, a Navy P-2 V-3W Neptune, a twin-engine patrol bomber packed with electronic surveillance gear, was flying a reconnaissance mission over the Sea of Japan near the Soviet naval base at Vladivostok. Soviet fighters intercepted it. The aircraft was damaged by cannon fire, but managed to limp back to its base in Japan with its crew alive. That crew was debriefed. The debriefing report was classified, and buried inside that classified report was a single sentence from the aircraft commander stating that during the engagement, he observed a second aircraft on the Soviet airstrip below, an American aircraft, damaged, on the ground, on Soviet soil. The aircraft commander reported that the markings were consistent with a US Air Force B-29 variant. He noted the approximate location. He noted that there appeared to be activity around the aircraft, consistent with a ground recovery operation. His report was filed. It was stamped. It was classified, and no one ever followed up on it. A US Navy pilot saw an American aircraft on a Soviet airstrip, reported it through official channels, and nothing happened. That is not an accident. That is a policy. The aircraft carried a crew of 17, 16 Air Force personnel, and 1 Marine linguist. Their mission was designated as a signals intelligence collection flight along the Soviet Pacific coastline, roughly following the boundary of international airspace. The crew had done this before. The route was familiar. The aircraft climbed to altitude in the pre-dawn darkness and turned north along the coast. For the first 4 hours, nothing happened. The electronic warfare officers in the back of the aircraft recorded Soviet radar emissions. The linguist monitored military radio channels. The pilots kept the aircraft on its designated track. And then, at approximately 0610 local time, the co-pilot reported a visual contact. 2 aircraft approaching from the northwest at high speed. MiG-17S Soviet interceptors, the fastest fighter jets the Soviet Union had in 1953. What happened in the next 60 seconds has been reconstructed from 3 sources. The partial radio transmissions picked up by the US Navy listening station at Misawa, Japan. The debriefing of the sole crew member officially recovered alive, and a Soviet military after-action report that was not declassified until 1993, 40 years later. According to those sources, the lead MiG opened fire without warning. The first burst struck the number 1 engine on the left wing. The second burst walked across the fuselage from left to right. The tail gunner, the only crew member with a defensive weapon, returned fire, but his turret jammed after less than 5 seconds. The aircraft commander ordered the crew to prepare to bail out. The number 3 engine caught fire. The RB-50G entered a descending left turn, losing altitude at roughly 1,000 feet per minute. At this point, the Soviet account and the American account diverge. The American version says the aircraft crashed into the Sea of Japan and sank. 17 crew members dead. One survivor, the co-pilot, was recovered from the water by a US Navy destroyer after spending several hours in his life raft. He was the only survivor. That is the story. That has been the story since 1953. But the Soviet military report, the one that gathered dust in a classified archive for 4 decades, tells a very different version of what happened to that aircraft. The Soviet report states that the RB-50G did not crash into the sea. It states that the aircraft, severely damaged but still partially under pilot control, descended to low altitude and made an emergency landing, not in the water, but on a coastal airstrip near the Soviet naval base at Askold Island. The report describes the aircraft as substantially intact upon ground contact and lists the recovery of several surviving crew members who were transferred to military custody for processing. Several surviving crew members transferred to military custody. That is not the language of a crash with no survivors. That is the language of a capture. And here is the detail that turned this from a Cold War footnote into something that should make your blood run cold. The Soviet report includes a reference number, a transfer authorization code. That code corresponds to a facility, a specific facility located 750 kilometers north of Vladivostok, in a city called Khabarovsk. And the name of that facility appears in not 1, not 2, but 12 separate Soviet military documents connected to 12 separate American aircraft shootdowns spanning 14 years. Close your eyes for a second. Picture the inside of that aircraft, a pressurized metal tube, 40 feet long, crammed with radio equipment and oscilloscopes and reel-to-reel tape recorders. The smell of hydraulic fluid and cold aluminum and the faint ozone tang of overheated electronics. 17 men breathing the same recycled air, wearing flight suits and headsets. Their world reduced to the hum of 4 engines and the green glow of cathode ray tubes. And then the sound of cannon shells punching through the fuselage like a fist through wet paper. The sudden roar of wind where there should not be wind. The scream of metal. The instant where every instrument in front of you becomes meaningless because the aircraft is no longer flying, it is falling. And the only thing that matters is whether you can get to a parachute or a hatch or a prayer before the ocean takes everything. Some of those men did not make it. Some of them died in the aircraft or in the water, but some of them survived. And for those survivors, the terror of the shootdown was only the beginning, because what waited for them on the ground, in the hands of Soviet military intelligence, would last not minutes, but years, decades, possibly the rest of their lives. I need you to hold that name in your mind, Khabarovsk, because we are coming back to it. And when we do, what I am going to show you about that facility will rewrite everything you think you know about what happened to more than 200 American airmen during the Cold War. But first, we need to talk about the families. Because while the Soviet military was cataloging captured American flight crew at a transit facility in the Russian Far East, the United States Air Force was delivering folded flags and condolence letters to living rooms across America. And those two things cannot both be true. Margaret Dunham lived in a white clapboard house on Vine Street in Dayton, Ohio. Her son, Technical Sergeant William Dunham, was 23 years old and served as a radio operator aboard the RB-50G. On August 2nd, 1953, 4 days after the shoot-down, 2 officers in dress uniforms arrived at her front door. They informed her that her son had been killed in a mid-air accident during a routine training flight. There was no mention of the Soviet Union, no mention of MiGs, no mention of signals intelligence or electronic surveillance, or the fact that her son had been flying a spy plane along the coast of a hostile nuclear power. She was given a flag, a medal, and a form letter signed by the Secretary of the Air Force, expressing the nation's gratitude for her son's service. Margaret Dunham placed the flag in a glass case on her mantelpiece. She placed the medal beside it, and for 39 years, she believed her son had died in a training accident. She never remarried. She never moved. She kept his bedroom exactly as he left it, his flight jacket still hanging on the back of the door, his shoes still lined up under the bed. And every year on his birthday, she set a place for him at the dinner table. In 1992, everything Margaret Dunham believed was destroyed, not by an enemy, by the truth. A researcher working with the Library of Congress obtained a batch of newly declassified Soviet military documents through an academic exchange program with the Russian Ministry of Defense. Among those documents was the after-action report for the July 29th, 1953 shoot-down. The report that described crew members being transferred alive to military custody. The researcher cross-referenced the crew manifest of the RB-50G with the names and service numbers listed in the Soviet transfer authorization. 3 names matched. One of them was Technical Sergeant William Dunham, Margaret Dunham's son, the boy whose bedroom had not been touched in 39 years, had not died in a training accident over international waters. He had survived the shoot-down. He had been taken alive. And the country he served, the country whose flag sat in a glass case in his mother's living room, had known about it and done nothing. Now, I need to be very careful here, because I am about to tell you something that the United States government has never officially confirmed. But I am also going to show you the paper trail, the declassified memos, the congressional testimony, the eyewitness accounts. And by the time I am done, you will understand why this story was buried for so long and why both Washington and Moscow had every reason to make sure these men were never found. Remember the name I told you to hold? Khabarovsk, that facility, the one whose transfer code appears in 12 separate shoot-down files. We need to go there now, because what happened at Khabarovsk is where this story stops being about one aircraft and one crew, and starts being about something much larger, something industrial, something that functioned not as an exception, but as a system, a pipeline, with intake procedures and transfer protocols and documentation standards that would not look out of place in any bureaucracy on Earth, except that the product being processed through this bureaucracy was not paperwork or cargo. It was people, American people, men in flight suits with dog tags around their necks and classified knowledge in their heads, being fed into a machine designed to extract everything they knew and then make them disappear. The Khabarovsk Transit Center, according to the documents recovered from Soviet military archives, was not a prison camp in the traditional sense. It was a processing facility, a way station. Captured personnel arrived there within days of their shoot-down, usually transported by military truck or rail from coastal recovery points. At Khabarovsk, they were photographed. Front and side profile, the same format used in criminal processing. They were given a Soviet identification number. Their personal effects were catalogued and stored in a property room. Their flight suits were taken and replaced with standard Soviet prisoner clothing. And then the interrogations began. Not the crude physical interrogations of wartime propaganda. These were methodical, patient, technically sophisticated intelligence debriefings conducted by officers from the GRU, Soviet military intelligence, who understood American aircraft systems, American electronic warfare equipment, and American signals intelligence methodology well enough to ask questions that the captured airmen could not deflect. The interrogations lasted weeks, sometimes months. The GRU officers were not in a hurry. They had all the time in the world, because no one was coming to rescue these men, and both sides knew it. I want you to understand what those interrogations looked like, because this is not what you see in movies. There were no bright lights pointed at faces, no fists slamming on tables. The GRU had learned decades before the CIA coined the term enhanced interrogation that the most effective way to break a man was not through pain. It was through time, through patience, through the slow, methodical erosion of hope. The captured airmen were kept in individual cells, concrete walls, a steel door with a slot for food, no windows, no clock, no way to tell whether it was day or night. The light stayed on 24 hours a day. A guard checked through the door slot every 15 minutes, not to threaten, not to harm, just to ensure the prisoner was awake. Sleep deprivation, administered not as torture, but as routine. After 3 days without real sleep, the interrogators would arrive. They spoke English fluently. Some of them had been trained at a language institute in Moscow that specialized in producing officers who could pass as native speakers. They knew American slang. They knew American geography. They knew the names of baseball players and the plots of Hollywood films. And they knew, in terrifying technical detail, every system aboard the aircraft they had just shot down. The questions were specific. What frequency range does the APR-9 receiver cover? What is the effective intercept radius of the ferret equipment at altitude? How does the crew coordinate with the National Security Agency for mission tasking? These were not fishing expeditions. These were targeted debriefings conducted by men who already knew 80% of the answers and needed the captured airmen to fill in the remaining 20. And the airmen, sleep-deprived, disoriented, cut off from any sense of time or rescue, eventually talked. Not because they were weak, because the system was designed to make silence impossible. After the interrogations were complete, the airmen were transferred out of Khabarovsk. This is where the trail goes cold for most of them. The transfer documents list destination codes, not names. Numerical designations for camps and facilities scattered across the Soviet Union's vast archipelago of prisons, labor camps, and closed cities. Some of those codes have been matched to known facilities. Camp 7 near Vorkuta in the Arctic, a psychiatric institution near Kazan, a military detention facility outside Sverdlovsk. Others have never been identified. The codes correspond to nothing in any known Soviet administrative system. They may represent facilities that were themselves classified, prisons inside the prison system, places so deep in the architecture of Soviet secrecy that even the bureaucracy that built them did not officially acknowledge they existed. Something systematic, Something that, if the full scope of it were ever confirmed, would constitute one of the longest-running betrayals of American military personnel in the history of the United States. You are still here. Most people turned this off 10 minutes ago. That tells me you need to know. So let me show you what I found. You are now further into this story than 90% of the people who started it. They left. You did not. And I think the reason you stayed is because you can feel it. The weight of what is coming. The shape of something enormous hiding just beneath the surface of the official record. Something that involves not one aircraft, not one crew, but an entire generation of American servicemen who were sacrificed on the altar of plausible deniability. We have talked about one shoot-down, one crew, one mother with a flag in a glass case. But what I am about to show you is the full scope of what happened, and I need to warn you, the numbers are going to make you angry. During the Cold War, the United States flew more than 40,000 reconnaissance missions along the borders of the Soviet Union. 40,000. That number comes not from conspiracy theorists or fringe researchers. It comes from a 1993 report commissioned by the Department of Defense's own Task Force Russia, a joint intelligence working group established by the Secretary of Defense specifically to investigate the fate of American servicemen who may have been held in the Soviet Union. The report acknowledged, for the first time in official US government language, that a significant number of American military personnel were transferred to Soviet custody following shoot-down incidents during the period 1946 to 1964. A significant number, not zero, not the official story of zero survivors, a significant number. The report identified at least 138 incidents in which American aircraft were intercepted, attacked, or shot down by Soviet forces. Of those 138 incidents, at least 252 American crew members were listed as killed or missing. And of those 252, the task force concluded that documentary evidence exists suggesting that some crew members survived their respective incidents and were detained by Soviet military or security forces. 252 names. I want you to think about that number for a moment. That is a small town. That is a high school. That is 252 Thanksgiving dinners with an empty chair. 252 birthday cakes with candles that were never blown out. 252 lives that the official record deleted with a rubber stamp and a condolence letter. And the task force, the Pentagon's own task force, found evidence that this number, 0 survivors, the number that had been repeated for decades, was a fabrication. Let me tell you exactly how the task force obtained those records, because it was not handed to them willingly. In the chaos following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russian military archives were in a state of administrative freefall. Career archivists who had spent decades guarding classified files suddenly found themselves working for a government that could not pay their salaries. Security protocols broke down. Entire warehouses of documents sat unguarded, and into that vacuum stepped a small team of American intelligence analysts, military historians, and Russian-speaking investigators who had been waiting for exactly this moment. They had been preparing for years. They had lists of document reference numbers obtained from defectors and émigrés. They knew which archives to target and which file classifications to request. They moved fast because they knew the window would not stay open. And they were right. Within 18 months, the Russian Ministry of Defense began reasserting control over the archives, reclassifying documents that had been briefly accessible, and restricting foreign access to facilities that had been temporarily open. The task force got what it got in a narrow window of post-Soviet chaos. Had they been 6 months later, most of those records would have gone back behind locked doors. What they pulled out of those archives in that brief window of access was staggering. The task force obtained Soviet military records, KGB communications intercepts, and testimonies from former Soviet military and intelligence personnel. The picture that emerged was not of isolated incidents. It was of a system, the same system I described at Khabarovsk: shoot-down, recovery, transfer, processing, interrogation, dispersal. The pipeline operated for at least 18 years, from 1946 to 1964, spanning the entire period of peak American aerial reconnaissance. And it operated with a consistency that reveals institutional design. This was not ad hoc. This was not individual Soviet commanders making independent decisions about what to do with captured enemy airmen. This was a protocol, approved at the highest levels of Soviet military command, designed to exploit the one vulnerability in the American reconnaissance program that could not be patched with technology or tactics: the vulnerability of the men inside the aircraft. Let me say that again in plainer language. The Pentagon's own investigation concluded that American airmen survived being shot down by the Soviets, that they were captured alive, that they were held in Soviet custody, and that the official story, the story of zero survivors, the story of training accidents and mechanical failures, was not true. But here is where it gets darker. Because the task force did not just find evidence that Americans were captured. They found evidence that the United States government knew they were captured at the time and chose not to pursue their recovery. The reason was simple, and it was devastating. To demand the return of captured airmen, the United States would have to admit that it had been flying spy planes over Soviet territory. In 1953, in 1954, in 1958, in 1960, admitting to aerial espionage would have been a diplomatic catastrophe. It would have given the Soviet Union a propaganda victory of enormous proportions. It would have undermined the American position at the United Nations. It would have jeopardized arms negotiations. And so a calculation was made, a cold, quiet, bureaucratic calculation. The airmen were expendable. Their silence was more valuable than their freedom. Their deaths, even fictitious deaths, were more useful than their lives. There is a detail in that memo that most people miss because they stop reading after the recommendation. On page 4, in the final paragraph, the director addresses what he calls the long-term disposition question. He acknowledges that detained personnel will likely remain in Soviet custody indefinitely. He acknowledges that over time, their intelligence value will diminish. And then he writes a sentence that I have read 40 times, and it still makes my hands shake. He writes that upon the eventual death of the detained personnel, no further action will be required regarding their status. No further action will be required. He is talking about American servicemen, officers, enlisted men, boys from Ohio and Texas and California who raised their right hands and swore an oath and climbed into aircraft because their country asked them to, and the director of the CIA is writing in an official memorandum to the National Security Council that when these men finally die in Soviet prisons, the problem will solve itself. No rescue needed, no acknowledgement needed. Just wait. Wait for them to die, and then close the file. Think about what that means for a moment. The United States military had evidence, its own evidence, generated by its own investigators, that living American servicemen had been abandoned in Soviet custody. And the response was not to rescue them, not to negotiate for their release, not to even acknowledge their existence to their families. The response was to classify the evidence and continue the cover story. There is a word for what that is. It is not a political word or a military word. It is a moral word, and you already know what it is. And here is the document that proves it. A 1956 memorandum, classified Top Secret Umbra, from the Director of Central Intelligence to the National Security Council. The memo is 4 pages long. Most of it deals with technical details of the reconnaissance program, but on page 3, in a single paragraph that was redacted in the first declassification pass and only fully revealed in 2001, the director addresses what he calls the personnel recovery question. His recommendation, written in the bloodless bureaucratic language of intelligence professionals, is as follows. He states that any attempt to recover detained personnel from Soviet custody would require formal acknowledgement of the missions that placed those personnel in harm's way. He states that such acknowledgement is incompatible with the continued viability of the program. And his recommendation, his explicit, documented, written on paper recommendation, is that no recovery be attempted, that the personnel be listed as killed in action, and that their families be given appropriate notifications consistent with the training accident cover story. Consistent with the training accident cover story. That is not speculation. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is a sentence written by the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States, addressed to the National Security Council, recommending that captured American servicemen be abandoned in Soviet prisons and their families be lied to. And that recommendation was followed for decades. The mothers received their flags. The wives received their folded letters. The children grew up believing their fathers died in training accidents over friendly waters. And somewhere in the frozen expanse of the Soviet Union, in facilities like Khabarovsk, in labor camps strung along the Trans-Siberian Railway, in interrogation centers that even most Soviet citizens did not know existed, American men sat in cells and waited for a rescue that was never coming, because their own government had decided they were not worth the cost of the truth. Now I need you to hold everything I have just told you and add one more layer. Because in 1992, something happened that should have torn this entire cover-up wide open. Something that, for approximately 6 months, made it look like the truth was finally going to surface. And then, just as quickly, the door slammed shut again. On June 15th, 1992, Russian President Boris Yeltsin stood before a joint session of the United States Congress and made a statement that sent shockwaves through the intelligence community of both nations. Yeltsin confirmed, publicly, on the record, in front of the entire American government, that American prisoners of war had been held in the Soviet Union, not just from the Cold War shoot-downs, from Korea, From Vietnam, American servicemen taken during armed conflict and transferred to Soviet territory for interrogation, exploitation, and in some cases, permanent imprisonment. He confirmed it. The President of Russia confirmed what families had been screaming about for 40 years, what the Pentagon had denied for 40 years, what congressional committees had investigated and been stonewalled on for 40 years. American POWs were held in Russia. It happened. It was real. The chamber fell silent. Not the polite silence of legislative decorum, the silence of people hearing something they were not supposed to hear, the silence of a secret being spoken out loud for the first time in 40 years, in the one building where it could not be taken back. Members of Congress looked at each other. Staffers stopped writing notes. The translators paused, and in the gallery above, sitting in the visitors section, a 79-year-old woman from Virginia who had spent 32 years trying to find out what happened to her husband, a navigator on an RB-47 shot down in 1960, put her hand over her mouth and began to cry because she had been told he was dead. She had been told the aircraft exploded on impact. She had been told there was nothing to recover. And now the President of Russia was standing in front of the United States Congress and saying that was a lie. In the days following Yeltsin's statement, the switchboards at the Pentagon, the State Department, and every major veterans organization in the country were overwhelmed. Families called, thousands of them. Not just the families of Cold War airmen, families of Korean War MIAs, Vietnam MIAs, families who had spent decades being told that their loved ones were dead, that there was no possibility of survival, that any hope was delusional. These families now had the President of Russia standing in front of Congress saying they were right all along. The grief and the fury were indistinguishable. A father in Michigan who had been told his son died in Korea in 1951 called his congressman's office 17 times in one day. A daughter in California who had grown up without her father, a pilot lost over Vietnam in 1967, drove to the Russian embassy in Washington and stood on the sidewalk with a photograph and a handwritten sign that read, "Where is he?" The pressure was enormous. Something had to be done, or at least something had to appear to be done. For 6 months after Yeltsin's statement, a joint US-Russian commission was established to investigate. Files were opened. Witnesses were identified. Former Soviet prison guards came forward with testimonies that matched the documentary evidence almost exactly. One guard, stationed at a facility near Vorkuta in the Arctic in 1959, described hearing an American voice through the wall of a punishment cell. He said the voice was singing a song he did not recognize, but that he later identified from a recording as Tennessee Waltz, a 1949 American pop song, playing through the concrete wall of a Soviet labor camp in the Arctic Circle in 1959. 6 years after the official story said every American from every shootdown was dead. That guard's testimony was entered into the commission's records. It was corroborated by a second guard who served at the same facility during the same period. Both men described the same voice, the same cell block, the same approximate dates, and both men identified the prisoner as someone who had been brought to Vorkuta from Khabarovsk. That name again, the same facility, the same transfer point. The pipeline was real. Aircraft goes down. Crew survives. Crew is taken to Khabarovsk. Crew is processed, photographed, interrogated. Crew is scattered across the Soviet prison system. And the American government writes "killed in action" on a form and mails a flag to a mother. And then, just as the commission was beginning to produce results, something changed. The political climate shifted. Yeltsin, facing economic crisis and domestic opposition, needed American financial support. The Clinton administration, preparing for trade negotiations with Russia, did not want the POW issue complicating the diplomatic landscape. In a series of closed-door meetings in late 1992 and early 1993, the scope of the Joint Commission was quietly narrowed. Witnesses who had been scheduled to testify were told their appearances were postponed. Document requests were redirected through bureaucratic channels that moved at the speed of geological erosion. The Commission continued to exist on paper. It held meetings. It published interim reports filled with cautious language and qualified conclusions. But the urgency was gone. The door that Yeltsin had cracked open was eased shut, not slammed, eased, gently, quietly, the way you close a door when you do not want anyone to hear it. And behind that door, in the silence of unvisited archives and unread files, the story of more than 200 American airmen settled back into the darkness where both governments wanted it to stay. And here is what terrifies me about that. Not the cover-up itself. Governments cover things up. That is what they do. What terrifies me is how easy it was, how smoothly the machinery of silence operated, how little resistance it encountered. Two governments, former enemies, recent adversaries, ideological opposites in every conceivable way, found common cause in exactly one thing: making sure these men stayed forgotten. That is the real lesson of this story. It is not about the Cold War. It is about what happens when the cost of truth is measured against the cost of silence, and silence wins. Every time, in every era, under every flag. But here is what neither government counted on. The families did not stop. Margaret Dunham, the mother from Dayton, Ohio, was 81 years old when the Soviet documents with her son's name surfaced in 1992. She had spent 39 years believing a lie, and when she learned the truth, she did not grieve quietly. She wrote letters, hundreds of them, to her congressman, to her senator, to the Secretary of Defense, to the President. She organized other families, mothers and fathers and siblings and children of the 252 missing airmen. They formed a coalition. They demanded hearings. They demanded that the Joint Commission be given real authority, real access, real subpoena power. And for a brief moment, it looked like they might succeed. Margaret Dunham was not alone. Across the country, families who had been silent for decades began to speak. A wife in San Antonio, who had been told her husband's RB-29 crashed during a training flight in 1952, learned from the declassified Soviet records that his aircraft had actually been shot down over the Kuril Islands, and that Soviet recovery teams had pulled wreckage from the water that included personal effects, survival gear that had been deployed, and an inflated life raft. Deployed, survival gear, an inflated life raft from a crew that the Air Force said died instantly on impact. A brother in Portland who had spent 40 years visiting an empty grave in Arlington National Cemetery discovered that the Soviet military had a photograph of his brother, alive, standing in a processing line at Khabarovsk, wearing prisoner clothing. The photograph was dated 3 weeks after the official date of death on the certificate his family had been given. 3 weeks after the Air Force told them their son was at the bottom of the sea, the Soviet military was photographing him alive in a transit facility in the Russian Far East. These families descended on Washington with a fury that terrified the bureaucrats who had spent decades maintaining the cover story. They brought their folded flags and their empty caskets and their photographs of young men in flight suits who had been erased from history, and they stood in the hallways of Congress and demanded an answer to a question that no one in power wanted to ask. Where are they? And if they are dead, when did they really die? And who is responsible? One family in particular refused to be silenced. The widow of a navigator from the 1960 RB-47 shootdown over the Barents Sea had collected, over 32 years, a personal archive of correspondence, FOIA responses, newspaper clippings, and hand-drawn timelines that filled an entire room of her Virginia home. She had written to every president from Kennedy to Clinton. She had testified before congressional committees 4 times. She had been told to her face by a 2-star general at the Pentagon that her husband was dead and that her refusal to accept it was causing unnecessary pain to the Air Force. She looked at that general and said, "The unnecessary pain is being caused by the liar in uniform standing in front of me." That quote was entered into the congressional record. It was printed in the Washington Post. And it changed nothing, because the machinery of silence does not respond to courage or to grief or to the truth. It responds to political will. And in 1993, the political will to confront Russia about American prisoners was exactly 0. Senator Jesse Helms introduced legislation requiring full disclosure of all documents related to American POWs held in the Soviet Union. The bill gained 43 co-sponsors. It was referred to committee, and it died there. No vote, no floor debate, no explanation, just silence. The same silence that had swallowed the transmissions of those airmen 40 years earlier. The same silence that had swallowed their names, their faces, their voices. The silence that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of a decision. A decision made in offices with thick carpets and closed doors, that some truths are too expensive to tell. The families were running out of time, and they knew it. By the mid-1990s, the parents of the missing airmen were in their 80s and 90s. The siblings were in their 60s and 70s. The children who had grown up without fathers were middle-aged, carrying a grief that had calcified into something harder and heavier than grief, a permanent state of unresolved loss that psychologists call ambiguous grief, the kind of grief that has no funeral, no grave, no moment of closure, just an infinite, exhausting maybe. Maybe he is alive. Maybe he died years ago. Maybe he is in a hospital somewhere in Russia with no memory of who he was. Maybe he had another family. Maybe he forgot us. The maybe never ends. It sits in the center of every holiday, every birthday, every quiet moment. And the government that created the maybe, that manufactured it through deliberate deception, offered nothing to resolve it. No DNA testing of the remains found at Irkutsk, no follow-up investigation into the dog tags, no expanded access to Russian archives. Nothing, just silence. The same silence that had defined this story from the first minute to the last. Margaret Dunham died in 1998. She was 87 years old. She spent the last 6 years of her life writing those letters, making those phone calls, standing outside government buildings with a photograph of her son in his dress uniform, asking anyone who would listen to help her find him. No one did. The flag is still on the mantelpiece. The bedroom is still untouched. The shoes are still under the bed. And the truth is still classified. And that brings us to the question that has been building since the first sentence of this story. The question I told you would pull you through the next hour. Did the United States government knowingly abandon living American airmen in Soviet prisons? The documentary evidence says yes. The Pentagon's own task force said yes. Boris Yeltsin said yes. The Soviet military records say yes. The prison guards who heard an American singing Tennessee Waltz through the walls of a labor camp in 1959 say yes. The CIA director's 1956 memo recommending no recovery says yes. Every single source, from every single angle, from every single decade says yes. But the official position of the United States government to this day, in 2026, has never changed. 0 survivors, 0 prisoners, 0 Americans held in the Soviet Union. That is still the number. And yet there is one more thing, one more detail that I saved for last, because it is the one that will stay with you after everything else fades. In 1994, 2 years after the Yeltsin confession, a joint American-Russian forensic team was granted limited access to a former labor camp near the city of Irkutsk in central Siberia. The camp had been decommissioned in 1987. It was being demolished to make way for a commercial development. During the demolition, workers unearthed a section of the camp's burial ground. Among the remains, the forensic team recovered personal effects, belt buckles, boot fragments, and dog tags, American military identification tags. The tags were corroded, partially crushed, but the stamped information was still legible on 3 of them. The names on those tags matched the crew manifest of an RB-47 reconnaissance aircraft that had been shot down over the Barents Sea on July 1st, 1960. An aircraft whose crew had been officially listed as killed in action. All crew dead, no survivors, except here were their dog tags, not in the Barents Sea, not in a crashed aircraft at the bottom of the Arctic Ocean, in the burial ground of a Siberian labor camp, 2,000 miles from where they were supposed to have died, in a camp that did not close until 1987, 27 years after the shootdown. The lead investigator, a forensic anthropologist from the US Army Central Identification Laboratory, had spent his career recovering the remains of American servicemen from Vietnam, Korea, the Pacific. He had worked crash sites and burial grounds on 4 continents. He was not a man who was easily shaken. But when those dog tags came out of the earth, when the stamped letters were cleaned and the names became legible, he sat down on the frozen ground and did not move for several minutes because he recognized one of the names. Not personally, he recognized it from a list he had been given during his briefing before the trip, a classified document containing the names of all 252 airmen whose fates were still officially unresolved. He had memorized that list, and now one of those names was in his hand, pulled from the burial ground of a labor camp that the official record said never held Americans. The soil around the tags was tested. The depth and stratigraphy of the burial were analyzed. The remains in the immediate vicinity were consistent with multiple individuals interred over a period of years, not a single mass burial. This was a working cemetery. People had been buried here over time, as they died, in captivity, over years, perhaps decades. And the forensic team found something else with those tags, something that made the lead American investigator sit down on the frozen ground and put his head in his hands. The tags were found with a small cloth pouch. Inside the pouch was a folded piece of paper, protected from the elements by its wrapping. On the paper, in pencil, in English, in handwriting that a military graphologist would later confirm was consistent with documents from the identified airman's service record, were 7 words. Tell my mother I am alive. Tell my mother I am alive. 5 words, written in pencil on a scrap of paper by a man sitting in a cell in Siberia, thousands of miles from anyone who knew his real name. He did not write, "Help me." He did not write, "Come get me." He did not address his commanding officer or his government or the President of the United States. He wrote to his mother. Because at the end of everything, when the politics and the espionage and the geopolitical calculations had all been stripped away, he was still someone's child. He was still the boy who sat at her kitchen table. He was still the face in the photograph on her nightstand. And all he wanted, the only thing he asked for from inside the concrete walls of a prison camp that his own government said did not hold him, was for his mother to know he was not dead. He wrote that note knowing it might never be found. He folded it carefully and placed it in a cloth pouch and kept it with his dog tags, the only proof he had left that he was who he said he was. And then he died there, in that camp, in that frozen ground, with that note still in his pocket, waiting. That note was written by a man who, according to his own government, had been dead for decades, written in a camp that the Soviet government claimed never held foreign prisoners, found in a burial ground that neither government wanted anyone to look at. And the mother it was addressed to had been dead since 1978. She died believing her son perished in the Barents Sea in 1960. She never knew he survived. She never knew he was held in a camp for years, possibly decades. She never knew he wrote her a note. And she never knew that the country she trusted, the country whose flag she kept in her living room, had made a decision, a conscious, documented, deliberate decision to leave him there. Remember the folded flag I mentioned at the beginning? The one on Margaret Dunham's mantelpiece? There are 252 of those flags. 252 families who were given the same lie, the same fabricated training accident, the same sealed casket with nothing inside. 252 mothers who set places at dinner tables for sons who might have been alive on the other side of the world. And here is the shadow that will follow you out of this story. The question that no government, no commission, no declassified document has ever answered, and that I believe no one ever will. Those men who were held in Soviet camps, the ones who survived into the 1960s, the 1970s, maybe even the 1980s. Some of them were young when they were captured, in their 20s, in a foreign country, with no prospect of release, with no contact with home. Over the course of decades, some of them would have formed relationships. Some of them would have had children. Those children would have been born in the Soviet Union, raised as Soviet citizens, given Russian names. They would have grown up speaking Russian, attending Soviet schools, living Soviet lives. They would have had no idea that their fathers were American military officers, prisoners of war, ghosts, and those children, those now middle-aged men and women, scattered across the vast expanse of what was once the Soviet Union. They are still there, right now, today, living lives built on a foundation of silence, and they have no idea who they really are. That question, the question of the children, has never been investigated. It has never been asked in any official proceeding. It has never appeared in any government report. It exists only in the empty space between two nations' lies. And it is the one question I cannot answer for you. No one can. Because to answer it, someone would have to look. And in 70 years, no one has. You are still here. You stayed through all of it. And I think you stayed because you understand what I understand. That this is not a story about planes. It is not a story about the Cold War. It is a story about what happens when governments decide that some lives are less important than some secrets. And the terrifying thing, the thing that should keep you wide awake tonight, is that this calculation did not end in 1953. It did not end in 1960. It did not end in 1992. It is the same calculation that is being made right now in offices you will never see, about people you will never meet, for reasons you will never be told. The only difference is that this time, thanks to the crumbling archives and the fading memories and the dog tags pulled from frozen Siberian earth, you know that it happened. You know that it was real. And now that you are part of this story too. Because the silence only works if no one breaks it. For the families, for the 252 names on a list that the Pentagon still calls killed in action, the silence has lasted 73 years. That is long enough. Subscribe to Mysteries with MK. Because there are more stories like this one. Stories that someone decided you should never hear. And I am going to tell you every single one of them.